Newswatch magazine presents the analysis of world news in the light of Bible prophecy with David J. Smith.
President George Bush wants to establish a new world order by the year 2000. He believes that he is destined to usher in this new era of peace and prosperity for the whole world. Notice the text of his speech to the United Nations on January 16, 1991, as reported in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on January 17, 1991. Quote, "Our objective is clear. Saddam Hussein's forces will leave Kuwait. Iraq will eventually comply with all United Nations resolutions, and then, when peace is restored, it is our hope that Iraq will live as a peaceful and cooperative member of the family of nations, thus enhancing the security and stability of the Gulf. I, President George Bush, had hoped that when the United States Congress in historic debate took its resolute action, Saddam Hussein would realize that he could not prevail and would move out of Kuwait in accordance with the United Nations resolutions. He did not do that. Saddam was warned over and over again to comply with the United Nations. Leave Kuwait or be driven out. Tonight, 28 nations, countries from 5 continents, Europe and Asia, Africa and the Arab League, have forces in the Gulf area standing shoulder to shoulder against Saddam Hussein. This is an historic moment. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for our generations a new world order. A world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we're successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the United Nations founders. This to me sounds like Revelation chapter 13, verse 4, where it says in the middle of the verse, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" Does this mean that the United States of America, working through the auspices of the United Nations organization, is going to literally be the enforcer of the new world order? And another question arises. Does President Bush know the plans to have world government by the year 2000? In his speech to the United Nations on October 1st of 1990, he said, and I quote, "We must join together in new compact to bring the United Nations into the 21st century. The calendar offers up a convenient milestone, a signpost by which to measure our progress as a community of nations. The year 2000 marks a turning point, beginning the turn of the millennium. The United Nations can help bring about a new day, to press forward, to cap an historic movement. And the only movement that has been in the 19th and 20th century has been international world socialism. But he says to cap off an historic movement toward a new world order." End of quote. That came from the New York Times, October 2nd, 1990, page A6. He knows that even our money shows the same hope of a new world order. I quote, Parade Magazine, July 2nd, 1989, page 5. "That desire for freedom from tyranny inspired the world and still does. Look on the back of any dollar bill, and you'll see it. The Great Seal of the United States bears the motto Novus Ordo Seclorum, meaning a new order of the ages." End of quote. On March 16th, 1989, a radio station played part of a speech that President Bush delivered. He said, and I quote, "What are we doing to prepare ourselves for the new world order coming in just 11 years from now?" End of quote. No wonder he had to make war with Iraq to establish the United Nations as the world authority for the 21st century. President Bush has already made preparations to go to the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt, the site of the ancient initiation ceremony into Luciferian worship, in order to celebrate the new millennium. The Arizona Daily Star on January 3rd, 1989, carried this AP article headline, Millennium Group expects Bush at 1999 bash. It read, and I quote, President-elect Bush is spending this year's holiday at Camp David, Maryland. But in 10 years, he may be in Egypt. Organizers of the Millennium Society say he's already committed to ushering in the next century at the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Giza. End of quote. The article said Mr. Bush sent a telegram to the society, which said, and I quote, Barbara and I wish you the best of luck in the next year, and we're looking forward to your celebration in Egypt in 1999. End of quote, page A5. If we think that President George Bush does not believe that he has a mission to build a new world order, we'd better get our heads out of the sand. President Bush was a member of Yale University's Skull and Bones ultra-secret fraternity, also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, all of which were working for world government. Notice the United States plan to build the New World Order as laid bare in the New York Times newspaper March 8th of 1992. This particular newspaper article heading was, United States Strategy Plan Calls for Ensuring No Rivals Develop. And then underneath that headline it said, A One Superpower World. Now I'll quote from that article. Pentagon's document outlines ways to thwart challenge to primacy of America. In other words, this particular article points out that the United States of America is going to be the #1 nation on the face of the earth. It'll be the only superpower, and that no other nation will be able to rival the United States. This was a special article to the New York Times written by Patrick E. Tyler. And I'll quote parts of it. This was March 7th. And then it was published March 8th, 1992. Secretary Dick Cheney expects to release a document later this month. States that part of the American mission will be, quote, convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interest. End of quote. Now I'll continue the article. The classified document makes the case for a world dominated by one superpower whose position can be perpetuated by constructive behavior and sufficient military might to deter any group or nation from challenging American primacy. Then there's a subtopic in this particular article. It says, rejecting collective approach. To perpetuate this role, the United States must sufficiently account for the interest of the advanced industrial nations to discourage them from challenging our leadership or seeking to overturn the established political and economic order, the document states. In this particular newspaper article, it makes clear that the United States will not depend upon the United Nations organization in order to guarantee the peace of the world. I'll quote more of the article. The draft notes that coalitions holding considerable promise for promoting collective action, as in the Persian Gulf War, but that we should expect future coalitions to be ad hoc assemblies, often not lasting beyond the crisis being confronted, and in many cases carrying only general agreement over the objectives to be accomplished. So, they say that they cannot depend, this is the United States government, cannot depend upon other nations to work with them over a short period of time and can't even agree upon the objectives. So, what is the conclusion that they've come to? I'll continue to quote the article. What is most important, it says, is the sense that the world order is ultimately backed by the United States, And the United States should be postured to act independently when collective action cannot be orchestrated, or in a crisis that demands a quick response. Bush administration's officials have been saying publicly for some time that they were willing to work within the framework of the United Nations, but that they reserved the option to act unilaterally or through selective coalitions if necessary to protect vital American interest. So the United States is definitely promoting a one-world order only in which they are the primary power and the military structure to enforce world government on the rest of the world. The new draft sketches a world in which there is one dominant military power, whose leaders must maintain the mechanisms for determining or deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. And then they give their plan for Europe. They said that we must seek to prevent the emergence of European-only security arrangements, which would undermine NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which the United States is a part of, and therefore we dominate and control the military future of the European continent. And if this is the case, that means the United States of America, even though there will come an economic giant called the economic community that is coming into vogue in January 1st of 1993, if this target date is accomplished by all the members of the European Economic Community, but the United States will still dominate their military through NATO and will not allow them to rise to become a superpower in competition with the United States. They said in East Asia, we must maintain our status as a military power of the first magnitude in the area. And that was the end of the quote of the New York Times, March 8, 1992 article. But President George Bush is not wasting time. He wants world government, and he wants it quickly. But I want to bring up another problem in the world today, and that is not just the problem of world government through the eyes of the United Nations organization, the United States, or any other nation. I want to bring up the problem that there is a deceiver in the world today. In your Bible, in Revelation chapter 13, verse 1 and 2, it reads like this. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority. So there it is. It says very clearly that a beast, and in Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7, throughout the book of Daniel, it shows very clearly that a beast is literally a government in Bible prophecy. Therefore, when this talks about a beast rising, and you'll notice it has all the composite structure of the first beast, Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greco-Macedonian Empire, and so on. And so this is going to be a powerful government that has all the descriptive terminology of those particular governments. And so it's going to be a very powerful government at the close of the age. And it said that that Satan the devil will give power to this end time system. Now let's prove who that dragon is according to the Bible. Revelation 12 verse 9. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. If this end-time system is given power by Satan, it is only logical that it will actually follow in his footsteps. If he's the great deceiver of the whole world, this means that this end-time system will also be a deceiver. So the builders of the New World Order are actually masters of deceit. Let's get some background now and notice their masterful deceit to build their New World Order. because J. Edgar Hoover laid bare that they were the masters of deceit and that they literally would lie to the American people in order to establish as fast as they could their own system of government. They would go into government by lies, telling the American people what they would do and do the exact opposite as fast as they could to establish world government. They are truly masters of deceit. In the March 1992 McIlvaney Intelligence Report entitled Toward a New World Order, The Establishment versus the People, we read the following, quote, this is from the Boston Globe, January 7th, 1992, by Pat Buchanan. I think George Bush wants to be president of the world. I just want to be president of the United States. End of quote. The 1992 American elections will pit the liberal establishment from the East that's working for world government against the American people. The Eastern establishment has had a stranglehold on the United States political and financial system for decades. And if it retains power, it's likely to deliver America into a globalistic, socialistic nightmare of the Orwellian, Hitlerian proportions. The people is epitomized by such candidates as Pat Buchanan, Howard Phillips, Bo Gritz, and others who want America first rather than globalism and international government. America is essentially a one-party system dominated by the liberal Eastern establishment that promoted international communism financially and that is working for socialism within the United States of America by paying off politicians and putting pressure upon them to legislate socialism upon America. Just like Nikita Khrushchev said that America would wake up one day and have a socialistic form of government and not know how it happened. The Eastern establishment is epitomized by such organizations as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, Yale University's Skull and Bones, the Bilderbergers, the Club of Rome, Socialist International, and wealthy globalist financial capitalists from the United States, Great Britain, and the European continent. Specifically, some of the names of those globalists are the Rockefellers, Andres, the Schultz, the Kissingers, the Brzezinskis, the Bushes, the Bakers, and so on. The establishment controls both the Republican and Democratic parties. Their financing, their media coverage, the candidates who will be allowed to run for high office in the United States, and their administrations once they're in power. As Robert W. Murray, M-E-R-R-Y, Robert W. Murray, executive editor of the Congressional Quarterly, recently wrote, and I quote, "Forget about whether a politician calls himself a Republican or Democrat. Think instead of the two fundamental political forces, the establishment party and anti-establishment populism. The establishment party includes most members of the government elite, Democrat and Republican alike. President Bush is in it. So is Michael Dukakis. House Speaker Thomas Foley, Washington Democrat, practically personifies the establishment party. But then so does Republican House Leader Robert Michael of Illinois." End of quote. So it should be no surprise when President Bush selects Robert Strauss, the former chairman of the Democratic Party, as his ambassador to Russia. Bush and Strauss work together, just like Ford and Carter worked together, Kissinger and Brzezinski, Vance, Schultz, Baker. Then there were men like Packard and Kennedy, opposite camps and yet seemingly, but they worked together. Bush and his would-be opponents, such as Clinton. Bill Clinton, running for the presidency of the United States, is a Yale graduate, skull and bones, a Rhodes Scholar trained in globalism. No wonder he's running in the other party, the Democratic Party. Kerry, Zonga, and all the rest running for the Democratic presidential nomination are all, in reality, just competing wings of the same political party. The liberal media elite, such as the Dan Rathers, the Tom Brokaws, the Ted Koppels, the Ted Turners of Turner Network, and hundreds more serve at the pleasure of this establishment party. The establishment owns both sides of all United States presidential elections. And this can easily be illustrated in the Ford and Carter race of 1976. David Rockefeller and the Trilateral Commission literally created Jimmy Carter out of the dust of South Georgia and assembled around him the most elite cabinet and administration hierarchy that were all members of the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations. They obviously decided upon Jimmy Carter and the Democrats in 1976, and yet they controlled President Ford as well, so that no matter what the sentiment against Carter or Ford was, one of their men would actually control the White House. And just as the communists in the old Soviet Empire has always been masters at creating and controlling their own competition and crafting for them the image of being true opposition, they always gave an image of someone competing against them, when in reality they're not competing against them. So the higher establishment in the eastern part of the United States has created and groomed a number of would-be politicians. They're called conservatives, who are highly publicized, but in reality, they're simply surrogates and stooges for the establishment, vying for their own power position within the establishment hierarchy. As 5 liberal Democrats vied for the nomination of their party in 1992, it must be remembered that the establishment cannot lose unless there's a groundswell of populists and a new party that actually comes on the scene in the United States. Otherwise, this 1992 election could be that which will deliver the sovereignty of the United States into the New World Order once and for all. The poor showing of President Bush in early primaries such as New Hampshire and South Dakota, then the upset victory of anti-establishment Republican Kurt Fordyce for governor in Mississippi, the defeat of Bush's pro-establishment Attorney General Thornburgh in the Pennsylvania senatorial race, the strong showing of David Duke in the Louisiana gubernatorial race, all point to a strong upsurge of the anti-establishment populism across America. This upsurge has the establishment very frightened that they might lose control. And that's why, if they can repackage George Bush as a conservative and stabilize the economy long enough to squeak by the November 3rd elections for the presidency for the next 4-year term, they'll move very quickly in order to move the United States of America into the New World Order during George Bush's second term. Bush, who will do anything to get reelected, may even launch Operation Desert Storm Part 2 to get Saddam Hussein in order to regain his falling popularity. Or he might do something such as an invasion of Cuba or Nicaragua in order to say that he was the man that took communism out of the Western Hemisphere. Anything to regain his popularity. But is President George Bush in trouble with the American people? Columnist A.M. Rosenthal wrote recently, and I quote, "A year ago, no leader stood higher in the esteem of the world and his countrymen than George Bush. Then, at the moment of victory, everything began to slide into a series of errors, misjudgment, switches, and desertion of old friendships and principles around the world." End of quote. The columnist went on to enumerate the highlights of the George Bush fall from glory. Quote, He permitted Saddam to remain in power and to use his surviving air and ground forces to obliterate or drive into exile hundreds of thousands of Kurds who Bush had encouraged to revolt and who had vainly trusted him and America. Bush opposed independence for the Baltics and the Russian republics from their communist slave masters. Bush formed an alliance with the Islamic communist dictator of Syria, whose only discernible difference from Saddam Hussein is the shape of his mustache. End of quote. So President George Bush has formed a very close alliance with the communist dictator, the butchers of Tiananmen Square, even as his relatives and establishment comrades in business reap billions in profits from United States and Chinese trade and business deals. He crawled on his knees to Japan to beg trade concessions, and then, of course, literally fell on his face before the world's television audiences. Thomas Sowell, writing in the Washington Times of January 5th, 1992, observed that there were tremendous similarities between George Bush and his New World Order partner Mikhail Gorbachev, who Bush struggled long and valiantly to save. Both were political pragmatists with no stronger foundation of belief than a New World Order. Gorbachev was perceived to have lost his belief in Marxism-Leninism. That's why he was overthrown. And Bush is widely perceived to believe in nothing except his own election at all cost. Sowell wrote in his column, quote, "Pragmatism has its limits. When people no longer know what you believe in, they no longer believe in you. Uncertainty is deadly in its political and economic effects." End of quote. Today, Bush's believability and credibility are dropping as rapidly as Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter fell from glory. Bush is progressively seen as a shallow political hack who will say anything or do anything to manipulate any event in order to be re-elected. But don't underestimate him. He has the tremendous power of the establishment and his incumbency as president and of the media at his disposal, so he can manipulate events more than any of his opponents to gain re-election. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running against Jimmy Carter, Reagan asked the question, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" The resounding answer was no. A Washington Post ABC News poll recently asked the same question. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? 78% of those answered no. Between June of 90 and December of 1991, 3 million Americans lost their jobs with sharp drops in employment in 25 of the 50 states, including electoral giants such as California, New York, Florida, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan. According to the Democrats, the United States economy has only grown at 0.5% per year since George Bush came into office. The establishment-oriented U.S. News and World Report pointed out in the article February 17, 1992, entitled, quote, "George Bush's Last Stand," end of quote. That, and here's what the article said, "Bush leadership has left us with a deficit approaching $500 billion, which has raised the cost of capital and drained it from public and private investments and infrastructure more than any time since World War II." End of quote. The article also stated that the Bush administration had pushed money available for new investment, new plants, new equipment to the lowest level since World War II. U.S. News and World Report went on to point out Bush's policy reversals, such as no new taxes in 1989, and then all of a sudden new taxes in 1991, Then all of a sudden he says, let's have a tax cut in 1992. Quote, comes so thick and fast that to read his lips, you have to be dyslexic, end of quote. So they admit you never know what George Bush is going to do next. Commenting on Bush's quick fix economic solutions in order to get reelected, the U.S. News and World Report said, and I quote, there is not the budgetary discipline of legitimate conservatism. This is not a long-term battle plan. This is sheer political cynicism and panicky opportunism. The Bush administration is thinking no further ahead than Election Day, end of quote. Jeane Kirkpatrick, United States Ambassador to the United Nations Organization under President Reagan, former President Reagan, had this to say, quote, Bush is in serious trouble, facing a very difficult, possibly insurmountable problem in being reelected in a faltering economy, end of quote. The early primaries and polls would appear to confirm her opinion. Bush only got 53% of the New Hampshire vote versus 41% for Buchanan. And 30% of the Republicans refused to vote for Bush in South Dakota, even though he ran unopposed. An AP poll released February 5th, 1992, said only 38% of Americans think Bush should be reelected. 48% said he should not. 21% of the Republicans, 52% of the independents polled said that he should not be reelected. 41% of those polls said the Democrats could do the best job with the economy versus 32% who thought the Republicans could. Now, I want to give just a simple observation. Will we be better off with Governor Clinton, Yale University's skull and bone man, Rhodes Scholar training in globalism? I don't think we'll be any better off with him than we would be with any other presidential candidate. The news media and the public saw that Bush's State of the Union address on January 28, 1992, the economic and rhetorical sleight of hand that he used. Here's what Barron's magazine said, quote, the new budget, going for the gimmicks. They knew and recognized what George Bush was doing. The Wall Street Journal said, this is their topic, a spoonful of sugar won't help Bush's medicine go down. The Los Angeles Times pointed out that Bush has given up any pretense of balancing the budget in the future. The Los Angeles Daily News referred to, quote, Bush's tax dodge, end of quote, and went on to say, quote, 75% of Americans say Bush's economic plan will not help them, end of quote. The late columnist Warren Brooks pointed out in December of 1991 that Bush's re-election bid is jeopardized by the biggest plunge in per capita disposal income since World War II. Bush's credibility has been further hurt by his denial that we were even in a recession in 1990 and 1991, and finally, in December of 1991, he reluctantly admitted it. Even as millions of Americans were losing their jobs and going bankrupt, and hundreds of thousands of businesses were shutting down, Bush was still denying that there was a recession. Bush promised Americans that he would not raise taxes, then gave them the second largest tax raise in United States history, only second to former President Ronald Reagan. And now he's trying to blame the Democrats. So this gave him more loss of credibility. The Bush administration has pushed through more federal regulations than any administration in United States history, which are totally hamstringing United States businesses and retarding the economy. No wonder we're going bankrupt as a nation, and they're going to use this in order to socialize America. If we can't control ourselves, then the government must furnish the solution for us. But in his State of the Union address, he promised a 90-day moratorium on new regulations. That's just like a bad joke. It's like the notorious bank robber Willie the Actor Sutton promising not to rob banks for 90 days. So President Bush has lost more credibility. The president, who was offered a $1.5 trillion budget with a $500 billion deficit in the fiscal year 1993, said with a straight face that he wanted a balance the budget amendment. Why didn't he furnish a balanced budget of his own? More loss of credibility in the eyes of the American people. Notice this quote from the New York Times, February 1st, 1992, and Patrick Buchanan said it, quote, George Bush looks upon himself as the chairman of the board of Skull and Bones International. He gets together with all the leaders of the world, and they decide this, that, and the other, end of quote. Then Patrick Buchanan in New Hampshire in February of 1992 said the following, I quote, some of these fellows have to wake up and realize it's not 1939 anymore. Most of these folks, that's the George Bush group, are globalist. They believe in subordinating American sovereignty to some globalist New World Order. When I see European countries giving up their currencies, giving up their control of trade, when I see George Bush engaged in the unilateral economic disarmament of his own country, I say, watch out, end of quote. George Bush has talked about the New World Order over 200 times in public speeches over the past 18 months. It's not just the figment of one of his speechwriters' imagination. It is the world government under the United Nations, not under the United States Constitution, talked and written about and planned for decades by the globalist, by the Marxist-Leninists. Fidel Castro was the first one who talked about the New World Order in 1979 openly to the public. And Mikhail Gorbachev began to speak about the New World Order in 1987. And then the New Agers also talk about the New World Order. The sovereignty of the United States Constitution would be replaced by the sovereignty of the United Nations Charter or some other international constitution. The United States military would be under the United Nations flag. And that's called for in State Department publication number 7277, a three-step plan where the government of the United States would turn over its military apparatus to the United Nations. And technically, the United States was under the United Nations Charter fighting the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and Operation Desert Storm. Then it would have a global currency if we were under the United Nations flag, a global banking system. There would be environmental protection agencies on a global scale. There would be an educational system that would be global. Population control authority would be in place through the United Nations. There would be gun control mechanisms, and that's what the International Socialists said. The last step will be to take the guns out of the hands of private citizens. And there would be a police force under the United Nations organization, and all these are talked about openly by President Bush and his Eastern establishment in connection with the New World Order. The welfare of the citizens of the world is far more important to President Bush and the New World Order than it is the welfare and jobs of the American people. President Bush's Operation Desert Storm, which stopped the United States military just short of victory, was fought, and in the word of the president, quote, as a stepping stone to the new world order, end of quote. It was the first military enforcement action of the new world order. But what about the new financial world order? The following is excerpt from the Ron Paul investment letter. Quote, when Bush goes around the globe implementing the New World Order, he's doing more than signing trade pacts, giving away money, and instituting cooperative military arrangements. He's also making your bank account subject to globalist prying. Yet this is part of the New World Order that is never mentioned in the media. The effort to unite the IRSs, the tax collecting agencies of the world, in a global database with an enforcement network to make all financial transactions subject to bureaucratic scrutiny. The goal is to eliminate private financial transactions wherever they occur. The means include United Nations treaties, pacts among the various members of the Organizations for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the Treasury Department. The United States has always taken the lead, as they say in Washington, on tax evasion, money laundering, and financial privacy. This country has some of the worst laws in the world. Today, American banks are an arm of the law. Even check cashing companies and wire transfer businesses have become government handmaidens. I'm still quoting the Ron Paul newsletter. Major retail outlets have been terrified by sting operations and now fear anyone using cash. Customs, the IRS, the BATF, and Secret Service all conduct their own investigations to make retailers file Forms 8300 on cash users. Texas has been swept by these agents. Buffalo, New York, was swept by these agents, and they collected $3.5 million. And so has Arkansas, where they collected $2.5 million from retailers there because of the lack of the filling out of Form 8300, which is new, reporting cash purchases in retail outlets. Before the Christmas holidays of 1991, tax agents visited more than 5,000 businesses. This sounds exactly like the Orwellian 1984 book, where everybody was a spy on everyone else. But all these things are happening right before our eyes, but it is not publicized, so that the American people don't really understand that we are being socialized at an accelerated rate. On February 1st, 1992, the chiefs of state of 20 countries, headed by George Bush, met at the United Nations and declared that, and I quote, the world community can no longer allow advancement of fundamental rights to stop at national borders, end of quote. They urged, and I quote again, that the United Nations abandon its tradition of non-interference in internal affairs of member countries, and that the UN should play a more active role in combating abuses, even if that means involving itself in issues that would once have been regarded as off-limits to the world body, because they involve the country's internal affairs. Nations are too interdependent. National frontiers are too porous, means has holes in it, and transnational realities too dangerous to permit egocentric isolationism, end of quote. I've reported many times that the Illuminati under Adam Weishaupt originally laid down its plans to destroy all national borders and build a one-world government exactly as the United Nations organization is outlined today. And right now, in 1992, President George Bush and the heads of 20 other countries met at the United Nations organization and said that the United Nations must have more power to intervene in the internal affairs of nations, which it is not supposed to do according to its charter. Now do we begin to realize the movie or the miniseries on ABC television, February 15th to the 22nd of 1987, where it showed that the United States of America was being occupied by the United Nations troops from the Soviet Union? They are actually laying the groundwork through this miniseries program and prompting the minds of Americans to accept United Nations occupation troops into our country and all other countries. George Bush, addressing the world leaders at the United Nations, said, quote, "It is the sacred principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter to which we will henceforth pledge our allegiance," end of quote. It was my understanding that when a president laid his hand on the Bible, he swore allegiance to the United States Constitution and upheld it. And yet President George Bush has now pledged the allegiance of the United States of America to the United Nations and its charter. I just want to point out that these sacred principles upon which Mr. George Bush referred were put down in writing by Soviet spy Alger Hiss, convicted in the courts of America as a traitor, and then given force by the signature of Joseph Stalin and Franklin D. Roosevelt. At the same United Nations meetings planned in February of 1992, plans were discussed to transfer national armies to the control of the United Nations. As the Los Angeles Times of February 1st, 1992 said, quote, "Creating a standing army under the control of the United Nations Security Council would give the world organization a military punch it has never had before and could convert it into a full-time international police force. The proposal for such a force, advanced by French President François Mitterrand and immediately endorsed by Russian President Boris Yeltsin and the Hungarian government, would permit the Security Council to act on short notice." End of quote from the Los Angeles Times. In the past 4 years, the United Nations Blue Helmets have been assumed 8 new peacekeeping operations. That was compared to a total of 13 in the prior 40 years of the United Nations peacekeeping troops' existence. So this tells me they're stepping up the United Nations operations. If this United Nations standing army is created, blue-helmeted United Nations troops from Russia, China, Europe, and Africa could be on United States soil within 3 to 5 years. We've already seen the movie America spelled with a K. They've prepared our mind. They said anyone who would not enter into the new age would be crushed on national television. Harvard professor Joseph Nye, N-Y-E, a former State Department official and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission, in a New York Times editorial of January 27, 1992, was blunt in coming out for a fire brigade or United Nations Rapid Deployment Force, led by the United States for the coming New World Order. I believe, this is my personal opinion, that if George Bush is reelected in November of 1992, that he and his establishment associates will try to immediately, within the next 2 years of 1993 and 1994, implement in its full fury the New World Order. by declaring some kind of state of national emergency. And it will probably be an economic emergency, and invoke all the executive orders which they have now in place. And they can declare a national emergencies and invoke these executive orders and therefore declare martial law in the United States of America. Some of these executive orders are number 10,995, which would allow the government to take over all communication media. Executive order number 10,997, that would allow the government to take over all electric power, petroleum, gas, fuels, and minerals. Executive order number 10,998, that would allow the government to take over all food resources and farms. Executive order number 10,999 would allow them to take over all methods of transportation, highways, and seaports. Executive order number 11,000 would allow the government to mobilize citizens and workforces under governmental supervision. Executive order number 11,001, take over all health, welfare, and educational functions. Then Executive order 11,002 would allow the Postmaster General, a member of the President's Cabinet, to operate a nationwide registration of all persons. Executive order number 11,003 would allow the government, federal government, to take over all airports and aircraft. Then Executive order 11,004 would allow them to take over housing and finance authorities to relocate communities, to build new housing with public funds, designate areas to be abandoned as unsafe, establish new locations for populations. Executive order number 11,005 would allow the federal government to take over all railroads, inland waterways, and public storage facilities. Executive order number 11,051 would allow the federal government to designate responsibilities of the Office of Emergency Planning, giving authorization to put all other executive orders in effect in times of increased internal tension or economic and financial crisis. In the McIlvaney Intelligence newsletter, he said that he had one last thought on the New World Order. He says that the New World Order will be no friend of conservatives, fundamental evangelical Christians because they're trying to emerge a world religion, or Orthodox Jews. He said as the New World Order is installed, it will progressively take more and more steps against these groups. That's through social and legal pressure, leading eventually to persecution and or imprisonment. What does he mean, though? Eventually leading to imprisonment and persecution. The book of Revelation is a projection forward into the last world social system, leading up to the very return of Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Let's turn to Revelation chapter 13, where it gives the rise of this end-time social system, and turn to verse 7 and see what it says this system will do to Christians who are following Jesus Christ. And it was given unto him, that's the beast, the leader of this end-time social system, to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given unto him over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So in Jesus Christ prophecy in the book of Revelation, it says specifically that there will be increased and intensified persecution against Christians. In Jesus' Olivet address to his disciples, he pointed down through the corridors of time to our day and said in Matthew chapter 24, verse 9 and 10, "Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you,
and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. Persecution and imprisonment are coming for all who will not fit into the New World Order. They even told us on national television, February 15th to the 22nd of 1987, on ABC's miniseries, America, that all those who would not fit into the New World Order would be crushed. But how is this going to happen? How is it that those who are going to take over the world, are they masters of deceit? Have they already planned and determined what they're going to do with Christians? Let's investigate and find out. You or I could be in trouble if we happen to subscribe to the wrong newsletter or belong to the wrong political group. When President Reagan implemented the secret Citizens Concentration Camp plans, codenamed Rex 84, it meant that you and tens of thousands of other Americans could be rounded up, herded into detention camps located throughout the United States. That's right. Rex 84 is a presidential directive whose primary purpose is to silence and hold prisoner those citizens and groups that the government considers troublemakers. And the only crime one need to commit to be qualified to be rounded up is to speak out against such organizations as the IRS, unfair taxation, administration policies which threaten constitutional rights of our citizens, or any of a number of illegal activities that the government is being engaged upon today, and that you and I recognize it. They would consider you and me as an activist and a threat to the government they're trying to establish. President Reagan's Rex 84 plan is merely a rehash of a similar secret proposals to silence patriotic citizens who work to restore the literal supreme law, the United States Constitution. On February 7th of 1975, Dr. Peter David Beater, Import-Export Commissioner under President Kennedy, was interviewed on a Los Angeles radio program. The station was KABC at that time, and exposed the plans for the replacement of the present Constitution with a new state constitution designed by internationalists working for world government. This new state constitution calls for the elimination of our guaranteed Bill of Rights, the elimination of many of our voting rights, plus the right to own private property. That sounds just like international socialism. It was written in 1964 under a grant to the Tax-Exempt Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. This was financed by internationalists who are not the least concerned about the individual rights and liberties of Americans, but they're working for world government. The new state constitution has the full support of several powerful elitist organizations, including the international banking cartel headed by billionaire David Rockefeller. This was actually written down in paper and recorded in Britannica Encyclopedia's volume, Great Ideas for Today, 1971 edition, page 345. It gave a summary of the 4,500-page draft of a constitution that would have the Chamber of Guardians, the Supreme Court, the Grand Council, the Tribune of the People, and the President. And yet, this would replace the Constitution of the United States that guarantees all of our freedoms that we take for granted. According to Dr. Beater's radio interview, the new state constitution goes hand in hand with the so-called rehabilitation camps secretly set up by factions within our government. At the time of the interview, 16 such camps had been opened under false pretenses, and more were being set up to make room for prisoners considered political opponents to this idea. In April 1976, after learning the full details of the citizen concentration camp plans, a concerned citizen by the name of Dr. William R. Pabst, P-A-B-S-T, filed suit against the United States government in an effort to expose and stop these plans being implemented primarily through the Defense Department. Dr. Pabst met with many obstacles during the suit, but was able to verify through various Defense Department and military officials that the camps do indeed exist and are to be used for patriotic citizens who does not want to see the dissolution of the Constitution of the United States. He uncovered documents spelling out the complete takeover of local, state, and federal agencies by the Law Enforcement Assistance Force, abbreviated LEAF, in the event of a national emergency called by the President of the United States. He also found that Executive Order number 11,490 authorized the President or his successor to call such an emergency and thereafter authorize various federal agencies to take over and implement rationing, confiscation of public and private property, including food, guns, precious metals, businesses, homes, and so on, and to reorganize local, state, and federal agencies under a single centralized federal bureaucracy. Isn't that exactly what they have in the Soviet Union? And yet these same plans are laid down. I must interject one thought right here. After this man, Dr. William R. Pabst, went through all of his ordeal to uncover all of this material, he put it on cassette tape in a live speech. It was transcribed. And suddenly, Dr. William Pabst disappeared from the face of the earth. No one knows what happens to this man. Executive Order number 11,490 also calls for the creation of 10 federal districts called new states and their capitals. And one of them is called the Heartland. And if you'll notice very carefully, many times on the evening news, it talks about, when it's talking about Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Iowa, it'll call it the Heartland area. And there's 10 such designated areas. These 10 districts are already being used by various government agencies such as the Post Office, the Internal Revenue Service, the Social Security Administration, and banking establishments. These are all illegal because they were not passed into federal law of the United States. The creation of these new states, along with the executive orders and Rex 84, are in total violation of the United States Constitution, which is why they're being implemented in near total secrecy, and it took a federal suit in the courts to gain access to the information. The executive order, once it's implemented, and put into use, it cannot even be reviewed by Congress for 6 straight months. Therefore, if they call a national emergency and implement these, it takes at least 6 months before Congress could even review why they implemented this executive order. Dr. Pabst's research revealed that clandestine military exercises have been conducted as practice maneuvers for the takeover of local, state, and federal agencies, and for the control and roundup of those who would assist the takeover plans. But you say, that was back in the 1970s. This is in the 1990s. In October of 1990, helicopters parachuted men into the yards and streets of St. Louis, Missouri, in residential locations, in what was termed riot control practice. Why would there ever be a need for riot control practice in the streets of the United States of America? Notice the newspaper article from the September 10th, 1991 San Francisco Chronicle. Here is the big headlines: Marines copters set city all abuzz. And then it said low-flying craft cruise through downtown skies. This was an article written by a Mr. Stephen A. Chin of the Examiner. This is the San Francisco Examiner staff. I want to quote much of this article. An urban warfare training exercise by United States Marines brought a dozen military helicopters swooping low over San Francisco rooftops this weekend, bewildering and outraging residents who besieged an equally mystified police department with phone calls. We've had literally thousands of calls, Central Police Station Officer Elizabeth Lowe said Sunday. The phones are ringing off the hooks. Our officers have been stopped on the street all day. Some callers report seeing a helicopter land on the Chevron building. Others said one landed on the Bank of America skyscraper. We've had helicopters coming in very, very low for the past 2 days, said Virginia Esker, who lives on Telegraph Hill. They come right between the buildings. I thought they were looking for someone. Lowe and other police officers, however, were unable to provide callers with any information about the mysterious helicopter sightings. We haven't been told anything, said Lowe. I've called the Presidio Army Base, Alameda National Air Station, and the FBI. Everyone is denying that it's their helicopters. This made some callers, like Patricia Smith, even more distraught. It's kind of Orwellian that you can't find out about it. At least the police should be informed, said an outraged Smith, who reported low, loud-flying mega choppers flying 100 feet above her home on Vallejo Street near Montgomery Street every 5 minutes on Sunday. Some are camouflage looking. Some are brackish, said Smith. They're like from the movie Apocalypse Now, only bigger. The CH-46 Sea Knight, UH-1 Huey, and the AH-1 Cobra helicopters, it turned out, are part of urban warfare training by a detachment of 200 Marines from Camp Pendleton in San Diego. The 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit and the 1st Marine Expeditionary Unit are forced several operations training group, according to Marine spokesman Hartman Slate. The unit, temporarily based at Treasure Island and Alameda National Air Station, is practicing urban flying techniques as well as ground reconnaissance and raids at local military bases through September 13th, 1991. San Francisco, because of its terrain, topography, weather, and the layout of the city, offers a training environment we can't get down south, said Slate. This training is critical because San Francisco has characteristics a lot like major cities in the Far East. Then the article went on to close by saying, the unit will be deployed to the Pacific in several weeks, he said. Peak activities occurred this weekend. That meant a lot of flying around downtown San Francisco. Well, that still does not explain the parachute drop of soldiers into the yards and streets of St. Louis, Missouri in October of 1990, does it? According to the April 23, 1984 issue of Spotlight newspaper, President Reagan updated the citizens' concentration camp plans when he signed a highly classified National Security Decision Directive number 84, codename Rex 84. On April 5th of 1984, the directive authorizes the activation of 10 huge prison camps located at key defense commands across the United States. A few of these are the original camps that were exposed by Dr. Pabst, in addition to a 1 million acre restricted area complex in Alaska to be used for brainwashing of government opponents during the takeover plans. It's called a mental health complex, but bizarre and torturous experiments are conducted there to find effective methods for controlling political prisoners. Another source has listed other areas that are now decided upon to be detention centers, and I'll point out a few of these for you. First of all, there's the Alaskan Siberian Asylum just southeast of Fairbanks, Alaska. Then on the eastern coast of the United States is Fort Drum, New York, is a possibility. Then Fort Indian Gap, Pennsylvania, which is northeast of Harrisburg. Then Camp A.P. Hill, Virginia, north of Richmond. Then Butner, North Carolina, north of Raleigh. Fort Benning, Georgia, near Columbus, Georgia. Camp Crome, Florida, near Miami. Also, the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, northeast of Pensacola. Others are Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, southeast of Fort Smith. And then Fort Hauka, Arizona, south of Tucson. Then Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. Then Oakland, California, east of San Francisco. Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, southeast of Eau Claire. All these are possible concentration camps thus far. Each of these facilities apparently can hold between 15,000 and 25,000 troublemakers, with the facility in Alaska holding up to 1 million individuals. There was a man from Fort Smith, Arkansas that came to me in 1987 and had a first-hand description of a facility in the middle of Arizona, out in the desert, that an Army official who was about to retire, he and his buddies were driving the Jeeps in the desert, and they came over a hill, and here was a facility with barbed wire strewn around on the outside in huge rolls, barracks after barracks, and they were all empty, with a huge fence around it, and barbed wire slanting to the inside to keep anyone from escaping. There were no roads to this facility. The only way to it was by helicopter, and there were no roads. Spotlight newspaper cited 2 Army officers as the source for the Rex 84 Roundup plans, who stated that the public will be told that the detention facilities are to be used for the roundup of illegal aliens, but that's only a cover. But in fact, it'll be used for what they term as political prisoners or citizens who does not go along with the New World Order. The roundup, they said, would probably be anyone who protests our taxes, and the Marxist-Leninist program for world government is to take away from those who have and give to the have-nots. Therefore, you and I in America will definitely be taxed beyond all belief when the New World Order comes into vogue, and it's in place, and the redistribution of our wealth to the 3rd and 4th world countries. The broad definitions of Tax 84, along with a non-defined aspect of what constitutes a national emergency, leaves the detention camp proposal wide open as to who will qualify as a dangerous person when the roundup begins. The Rex 84 planners have a computer list of potential prisoners and a computer that will automatically type the names onto open arrest warrants the minute that the roundup begins. A woman talked to a member of our congregation. She was from Washington, D.C. and worked for the government, and stated that their computer network is in place. All they have to do is implement it. They even can produce holograms of an individual and make people think they're saying something when in reality it is not that individual at all, but a hologram that is made to look like that person. Former President Ronald Reagan declared more than one national emergency. This is something that's downplayed by the establishment media, who totally continue to ignore the dangers of the executive orders. In fact, on October 14th, 1983, former President Reagan declared a national economic emergency due to the debts owed the United States by foreign banks. And according to newspaper articles in January of 1984, it said that this declaration of a national emergency could give President Reagan the dictatorial power to close banks, freeze assets and bank accounts, close off export capital, call in all gold and silver holdings, call in and reissue a new devalued currency, and to slap on total price and wage controls. This is all a result of the collapse of the International Monetary Fund. Some of the federal agencies involved in Rex 84 include the FBI, CIA, U.S. Marshals, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Coast Guard, and most important of all, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is a branch of the Defense Department, and it's called FEMA, F-E-M-A. And FEMA will have life and death control over all of us during a declared emergency. FEMA also has the authority, which is illegal, but they've been given it by these executive orders, the authority to arrange succession to office and reorganize government agencies. They would have the power to revalue our money system and confiscate strategic materials like gold, silver, guns, private property. They would have the authority to oversee the training of personnel from public and private sectors in emergency procedures, to reinstate the draft, and to form a national police force, and to coordinate activities for international civil emergency planning. And every one of these are a direct violation of the Constitution of the United States. And yet, because of executive powers, it could be declared a dictatorship. Former President Reagan's Rex 84 plan merely updates the executive orders signed by former presidents like Nixon, Carter, and Kennedy. A source from the Spotlight newspaper stated that Rex 84 is the secret appendix to a series of orders dealing with the emergency preparedness. One such executive order, number 12,473, was enacted by Ronald Reagan on April 3rd, 1984, and it calls for the reorganization and federal control of national communication systems in the event of an emergency. Another part of Rex 84, and it's officially called Directive 84, contains an order for United States military and government agencies to track down terrorists anywhere in the world, and even to kidnap or kill them on the spot. Very little press coverage has been given to the Citizens Concentration Camp plans or the Hunt Down and Kill Directive, except for an article in the April 1984 Reader's Digest called Mr. President, This Isn't Russia, and it was by a Mr. Carl Rowan. On April 16th, White House Press Secretary Larry Speakes issued a brief statement about combating terrorism, but failed to mention any of the minor details of the Directive 84 that I've just discussed. Also on April 16th, on CBS television, a spokesman for the Anti-Defamation League, praised the hunt down and kill directive. Yet most Americans are in the total darkness concerning Rex 84. They've never even heard of it. If Rex 84 and the citizens' concentration camp plans are to be successful, they must remain a secret from the public. The following is a transcript of a tape message by Dr. William Pabst concerning the implementation of a dictatorial government in the United States. This information so disturbed somebody, some agency, or governmental authority that Dr. Pabst disappeared from sight, never to have been heard from since. It must have been a threat to someone or a government agency. Now here is some of his message. I will subtopic this a national emergency, total takeover. Quote, this is Dr. William R. Pabst. My address is 1434 West Alabama Street, Houston, Texas, 77006. My telephone number is area code 713-521-9896. This is my update on the report of the concentration camp program of the Department of Defense of the United States. On April 20th, 1976, after a rapid and thorough investigation, I filed suit on behalf of the people of the United States against various personages that had a key part in the conspiratorial program to do away with the United States as we know it. This is a progress report to you, the plaintiffs, the people of the United States. The civil action number is 76-11-667. It is entitled Complaint Against the Concentration Camp Program of the Department of Defense. It was filed in the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas. The judge responsible for the case was Judge Carl Bue, B-U-E. Now I'll quote his transcript. You have no doubt heard the story, and he goes on to show that in Nazi Germany, during World War II, a man worked in a baby carriage factory, so he was told. And then suddenly his wife became pregnant and had a baby, so they wanted a baby carriage because she couldn't buy one. So he smuggled individual parts from all different areas of the factory home. Then he put them together, and he found that he had not a baby carriage, but a machine gun. This is what's happening piece by piece in the United States of America in order to merge us in to a world government. Just like Nikita Khrushchev said in 1959 that the Congress of the United States would legislate by their liberals in Congress legislation, and one day we would wake up and be a socialist country and not know how it happened. He reported in 1976 that the Center for the Study for Democratic Institutions recently completed a proposed constitution for the new states of America. The center was Rockefeller funded. And to give an indication of the type of constitution proposed, the term national emergency is used 134 times. The document did not have a Bill of Rights, and the right to own arms as guaranteed by the United States Constitution was taken away. At the same time, House Concurrent Resolution number 28 waited for calling a constitutional convention on or before July 4th, 1976. We know that that did not occur, but they tried with all their power. The presiding officer of such an event would have been, at that time, Nelson Rockefeller, Vice President and President Pro Tem of the Senate. This particular resolution awaited in committee. Obviously, money would not be spent on this massive program unless there would have been a chance of actual implementation of the scheme for this new state constitution. However, in case the American people did not voluntarily adopt a new constitution, then there would be Executive Order 11,490, which would include a dictatorship for America. The executive order authorizes the secretaries of the various agencies to prepare for a national emergency type of situation, included but not limited to those specified in the executive order itself. To those who have had opportunity to read the order, there's nothing left to the imagination. There is no pretense. It's an outright order for a dictatorship in the United States of America. The order itself was prefaced in March of 1969 by another executive order which established the federal regions and their capitals, 10 different regions. All the departments of the government were involved, including the Law Enforcement Assistant Administration, the LEAA, the Health, Education, and Welfare. Congressman Larry McDonald had revealed to Congress that various guerrilla and terrorist groups were being financed by the federal government. They were actually to begin insurgent activities. And when they did that, Executive Order number 11,490 would be activated, and a dictatorship would be called. But if you'd read Executive Order number 11,490, you would see that a national emergency could be declared for any conceivable pretense whatsoever. If the order itself were activated, here's what would happen. The next day, you and your family would be standing in front of your local post office with your neighbors. The front door bursting with long lines of people waiting to be registered. After waiting in line with your family for hours, you finally get channeled through the doors. Once inside, you overhear the postal clerk with his sidearm strapped to his side, telling a frightened registrant, another neighbor of yours, "Look, there's nothing I can do. The truck behind the building will take you to a work camp where you have been assigned. Your wife has been assigned to a factory, and there's nothing I can do." Then your son or daughter looks up at you with a quivering voice and asks, "Daddy, why are we here?" You can't give an answer. Then dictatorship in America occurs. What about implementing the new government? Examining the organization chart of Executive Order number 11,490, you discover how we all have helped finance, through our tax dollars, the very mechanics of the overthrow of our Constitution. Executive Order number 11,409 designates certain authorities to the Office of Emergency Preparedness, which in turn designates authority to the various departments of the federal government. If Executive Order number 11,490 were implemented, the Post Office Department would be responsible for a national registration. The State Department would be responsible for the protection of the United Nations personnel or property and prevention of anyone escaping from the United States. The Department of Defense would be responsible for the expropriation of industry. They would take over industry, direction of services and national production systems. They would control censorship, communication takeover of non-industrial facilities. The Commerce Department would be responsible for expropriation or the takeover, selection, and international distribution of commodities, which in reality, if you want to take the Marxist program of redistribution of the wealth, it means that it would be the looting of America. Census information and Human Resources would also come under the Commerce Department. The Treasury Department would be responsible for collection of cash and non-cash items and the recreation of evidence of assets and liabilities. The Justice Department would have concurrent responsibility with the Department of State for prevention of escape of its citizens from the United States. It also would have the responsibility for replenishing the stockpiles of all types of narcotics, for a national police force, for correctional and penal institutions. That includes the concentration camps, which I believe there's enough evidence to show that there's now at least 37 concentration camps in America prepared for those who will not accept this New World Order. Also, the Treasury Department, or the Department of State and Treasury Department, will be responsible for mass feeding and housing of prisoners, and for the use of prisoners to augment manpower, which in reality would become slave labor, just as it is in the Soviet Union, Cuba, Nicaragua, and all other communist states such as China. The federal bank, which is not a federal bank, it's privately owned by those working for world government, would be responsible for the regulation of withdrawal of currency. They wouldn't allow people to withdraw too much currency. The General Services Administration would be responsible for the confiscation of private property for government use. The Health, Education, and Welfare Department would be responsible for the nationalization of education, which in reality, the Department of Education has already nationalized it. They would be responsible for health services, hospitals, and mental institutions. The Labor Department would be responsible for recruiting manpower, selecting manpower, referring manpower, and then allocating manpower so each particular person that was registered at the post office in this national registration would be told where he or she was going to work, just like in the Soviet Union. Former Soviet Union. The Housing and Urban Development would be responsible for transfer of persons to either temporary or permanent housing in regional emergency planning and cooperation. The Transportation Department is responsible for emergency enforcement and control and movement of persons and the emergency operation of the Alaska Railroad that would hold 1 million political prisoners. There are two specific agencies that we need to take a look at and keep in mind. They are the Health, Education, Welfare, and the Justice Department, as these two agencies are directly related to the Department of Defense. The various military departments are part of the Department of Defense. Under it, we have the Secretary of the Army, Chief of Staff, Deputy Chief of Staff of Personnel and Law Enforcement, United States Army's Forces Command, and then Continental Army Reserve and National Guard. And under that, we have the four armies dividing up the United States. Under the Fifth Army, we have the Provost Marshal, who is directly connected to the Deputy Chief of Staff for Law Enforcement Personnel. Under the Provost Marshal for the Fifth Army, we have the 300 Military Police Prisoner of War Command at Livonia, Michigan. At this point, I want to quote from retired Admiral Elmo Zumwal's book, On Watch. And he quotes Henry Kissinger as stating, "I believe the American people lack the will to do the necessary things to achieve parity and to maintain maritime superiority. I believe we must get the best deal we can in our negotiations before the United States and the Soviets both perceive these changes and the balance that occurs when these perceptions are in agreement, and both sides know the United States is inferior, we must have gotten the best deal we can. Americans at that time will be happy that I have settled for second, but it will be too late. End of quote. Zumwalt said, then why not take it to the American people? They'll not accept the decision to become second best while we're in a position of gross national product twice that of the Soviet Union. Kissinger responded, and I quote, that's a question of judgment. I judge that we will not get the American people's support. And if we seek it and tell that fact, as we would have to, we would lose our negotiating leverage with the Soviets. So we can see from this conversation that Henry Kissinger and others who have dealt with the Soviet Union and our place in world power politics have kept things from the American people. They have sold us out and have not let us understand the full import of what they're doing in secret. So even though Henry Kissinger wanted to negotiate us into a place of second in command in the world to the Soviet Union, we're not second. Rather, we're simply being merged into a world government, and now the military power of the United States is going to be used to enforce the one world government. So we can see that the intention of the State Department is not to fill in the American people on what they're actually doing in creating world government. On December 30th, 1975, the California National Guard actually announced in a press release that the state's military police battalions were organized and trained to provide immediate response to virtually every civil and man-made disaster, as well as to assist law enforcement officers in emergency situations, to carry out their law enforcement as well as their military mission and riot control. The training spoken of for the California National Guard covers subjects such as dealing with individual citizens, civil populations, detention procedures, citizens' rights, and similar matters. And you know as well as I do, when there is martial law or a state of emergency, citizens have no rights, because the Constitution is preempted. Even the uniform of the National Guards who participates in this program are different than the normal type that are worn. An Army spokesman would not reveal any more about the different types of uniforms, but the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department paramilitary units who have received this training also have Army fatigues dyed black for their uniforms. A further fact is the disaster preparedness plan for the Marine Corps Supply Center in California. Quoting from that document, quote, under the Constitution and the laws of the United States, the preservation of law and order is the responsibility of local and state government, and the authority to maintain the peace and enforcement, the law is invested in the authorities of those governments, end of quote. There are specific exceptions to the enforcement of law by local and state government. One of these pertains to federal intervention to civil disturbances in certain situations. Military commanders are deemed to have the inherent authority to take any measure reasonably necessary for the protection of life and property in the event of a sudden, unexpected public calamity which disrupts the normal process of government and presents an emergency situation that's dangerous to the population. This includes law enforcement duties. The manual mentions something called garden plot forces. Don Bell reported on July 25th, 1975, that in May of 1975, the 303 Civil Affairs Group of the United States Army Reserves in Kearney, New Jersey, conducted an exercise to sharpen plans for a military takeover of the state government of New Jersey. According to Colonel Francis Clark, they had conducted similar studies on how to seize municipal, that's city, and county government over the past few years. That's from 1970 to 75. But this was the first time they had studied how to take over state governments. Such units were trained during World War II to operate captured governments in foreign countries. We never had federal troops training to take over governments in the United States, however, until this time. When local violence or catastrophe struck, the National Guard under command of the governor has always gone into action. This is definitely not the situation from 1975 forward. They have now arranged it where there will be others than the National Guard that can possibly take over city and county and state governments. They also have programs. On February 16, 1975, in the San Gabriel Valley Tribune, that it was reported that the LEAA, funded by the Department of Justice, and the Police Foundation, which was funded by the Ford Foundation, were the prime movers toward implementing a national police force. A national police force that would go across state borders. Do we realize this is now happening? Get a ticket in another state. At one time, they simply took your driver's license until you paid the ticket. And then they mailed them back to you. Now they don't even discuss it with you. They give you the ticket. If you haven't paid it by the date, then they send it straight to your state government and the Driver's License Bureau, and you can't renew your license until you've paid that ticket in a different state. So there is now a program that is to function in the taking over of the administration of local and state governments in the case of an emergency. And therefore everything would be taken out of the hands of private citizens. All this information and much, much more is now being uncovered because they now have methods that they have protected. They have protected it from the public, but it's now being found out about for the controlling of the masses of the people once the government declares its state of emergency. And it is planned a police state. But I'm here to tell you that when we see this world government take over, then we're going to know, yes, there is coming persecution. They have their concentration camps prepared for many Christians. But also in Revelation chapter 12, Revelation chapter 7, it discusses that the earth helped the woman. Certain people were sealed for divine protection so that this end-time system could not bother them, could not kill them and martyr them. Someone will be divinely protected. I don't know who those individuals are. I don't know who's going to make up the 144,000. I don't know whose heart is totally right before God and sincere. I don't know who it is that is keeping all of God's commandments. Only Jesus, the Christ of Almighty God, knows those things. He's the one who will absolutely determine who will have opportunity to escape all the intense persecution and martyrdom that is coming upon America. But the plan for the concentration camps, the detention centers, is now in the open. Those who expose this information are in danger because the federal government does not want this information known. So you and I Know that the end-time system is here. There has been massive deceit and deception because those who are controlling the reins of the New World Order are worshipers of Lucifer. He is the one giving them power, Satan the devil. But I say, Lord Jesus, come back and establish your 1,000-year reign, because you have redeemed certain individuals. You have called us. You have redeemed us by your shed blood. You have made us kings and priests, according to Revelation 5, verse 10, and then in Revelation 20, verse 4, 5, and 6. And we will reign on thrones, and we will administer under the authority of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, the one and only Savior of this world, a government. That government will be perfect. It will overthrow the new world order that the one-worlders and President Bush is promoting. And Jesus Christ and his saints will reign supreme. Daniel chapter 7, verse 18 says that the time will come when the saints will take the kingdom and possess the kingdom even forever and ever. Then in verse 21 and 22 of Daniel 7, it says that this end-time beast system with a false prophet will be overthrown. In Revelation 19, verse 11 through the end of the chapter, it shows that the beast and the false prophet will be taken and cast into the lake of fire alive. You and I, as the true saints of the living God, the followers of Jesus Christ, have this opportunity to serve with him. But it won't happen until we receive our new glorified bodies, so that we cannot be assassinated by those who will rebel against the government of God. Godspeed the day that government will come.
You have just seen the Newswatch telecast of prophecy. For a 1-year free subscription to Newswatch magazine, send your name, address, and zip code to Newswatch magazine. Post Office Box 1073, St. Ann, Missouri 63074. That's Newswatch magazine, Post Office Box 1073, St. Ann, Missouri 63074. Also, ask for our audio cassette and VHS videotape list. Be sure to listen next time to the Newswatch telecast of prophecy with David J. Smith.